First thing I'd like to say is thank you very much for allowing me to be here. I've known about this organisation for a long while, and so it's very, very nice to come and actually see in reality what goes on. I'm Nick. I'm from Nottingham. I work at the University of Nottingham. I don't work anything to do with Dark Ages and ancient history, anything like that. I'm an engineer, but we're interdisciplinary, aren't we? And I understand there are a lot of engineers that are members, so I'm in reasonable company there. But as an engineer, I think we always have to solve problems and make things work, and so maybe there's some transferable skills that have come from engineering to doing something like investigating history. Maybe that's just my excuse anyway. The real reason I do things to do with history is because it interests me a lot, and I want to know what happened when. So, the Dark Ages. Well, what are the Dark Ages? There's lots of Dark Ages, actually, but the Dark Ages I'm referring to are, as we work back through ancient history, through Roman and Greek and all, and the Persian and Babylonian and the rest of it, we come to dates where we're not sure, because people weren't recording things, or perhaps they were recording things, but we've not got the evidence of what they were recording. But anyway, we are much less sure of exactly what happened when. So I know some of you probably are very, very familiar with all of this, and some of you less, because I know you're interdisciplinary. You know, you come from all sorts of different interests in this society, this group. So, just to tell you what, that's the world that I'm dealing with, and specifically dealing with Greece, Egypt, Babylon. The borders that I've drawn may be complete rubbish, by the way, because of course they fluctuated through the years, but approximately. Assyria, Hatti, the land of the Hittites, and I won't be saying much about this until the end, but Israel, that's down there. So we're really going to try to be looking at the internal dating of history, ignoring Israel, so I suppose that means, from my point of view, ignoring the Bible, and, well, perhaps referring to it in one point, and then working back, seeing what we can do. So, a few other countries, just to remind you where they are. Persia out there, Media used to be up there, Elam, ancient land of Elam down there near Babylon, Mitanni, for a period of history, very important power, situated up there in northern Syria, southern Turkey. Aram, referred to a lot in the Bible as enemies of Israel. For some reason I've put Troy there, I don't know why really, but there it is, somewhere up on the left. So, the bit that we absolutely know. Here's Greece. Here's a scale of years, and I think we absolutely know. Historians may debate some things, I don't know. The Roman conquest of Greece, well, it's a vague sort of time because it took about 40 or 50 years to get all of Greece, but never mind, somewhere around there, we know what happened when. There's a lot of documentation. We know exactly, well, yes, pretty much exactly, when Alexander the Great set off to conquer the world, or the fair bit of the world, pretty much all that map that we were looking at just now, he managed to get hold of. No mystery. We know quite a lot about when Athens and Sparta and other city-states, but they were the main two, were vying for supremacy. We know about the Persian Wars, when the Persians came and tried to land at Marathon, and famous battle, and they came along later and ended up at Thermopylae, where the 300 Spartans did their famous act of holding back the Persian army. Well, eventually they were all repulsed, so we know when these things happened. But as we go further back, we don't know so much in Greece, to be honest, and partly that's because they didn't write anything, at least not in the modern Greek script, before about 700 BC. So I can put, which I am putting, the first Olympic Games there, supposed to be run in 776 BC. I've put that simply because Greeks used to date from that point, rightly or wrongly. I mean, we don't have historical evidence to be certain that that's when it took place or if it took place, but we can kind of almost assume that it did. So I was going to try and put that onto the spreadsheet, but I think because it's so complicated, I'm going to go through the other countries and then we'll put them all on the spreadsheet all at once. That might be a more practical way of doing things. So that's Greece. We can do the same thing for Egypt. We know when the Romans came, when Mark Antony and Octavian, who then became Caesar Augustus, were fighting over the Roman Empire. They basically, as a side effect, took Egypt and ran it for a few hundred years. We know with the Greek dynasties, the Ptolemies, after Alexander the Great, we know, I won't say we know all, but we know about when things happened. We certainly know when Alexander the Great arrived and set in place the Macedonian dynasty. We know when the Persians came. We don't know much from Persian literature, but from Greek literature and other sources, we know when the Persians came, and they were in charge most of the time between there and Alexander the Great. Certainly were in charge again when Alexander came. Battle of Carchemish, why have I put that there? Oh, simply because it's a point of contact between a known pharaoh of Egypt, Necho, one of the Nechos, and Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. Fought a battle then. So we can synchronize across different countries, and it's and there, sack of Thebes, that's when the Assyrians came, so we can synchronize there. We know that from Assyrian literature, we know what happened in Thebes as well. But when we get back beyond there, 647, something like that, BC, no, 664 BC, I think, sack of Thebes, it's getting less certain. There's no external evidence, it's all from within Egypt. And the history that we've got, Manetho is the main historian that we refer to, writing in about 300 and something BC. That's a long time after the events. And so we're sort of trusting things that we're not sure whether we can trust or not. And anyway, different recorded versions of Manetho's histories are different. And so certainty is lacking once we get back beyond the point of contact with the Assyrians at the sack of Thebes. And Babylon, well, we know when the Parthians arrived, the Seleucids, they were stemming from one of the parts of Alexander's empire. We know when the Persians came through and quite famously conquered Babylon. That's all described in quite a lot of detail in the Bible. We know when Nebuchadnezzar was around, fighting various wars, not just the Battle of Carchemish. We know that obviously he came and defeated Judah as well. And we know things very well back to 747, Nabonassar, one of the kings of Babylon, who, well, the man himself was responsible, but during his time, a system of recording was instigated, which included a lot of astronomical observations. And of course, we can back calculate with some confidence. When I say we, I don't mean me, but clever people can back calculate with some confidence when most of these astronomical things happened. And so from that point on, we're pretty good in Babylon. Beyond that, no. We've got a king list, nobody trusts it, we've got all sorts of stuff, but nobody really knows. Sack of Babylon by Assyria. Well, yes, we know that happened from Assyrian records, I suppose archaeology as well, and again, another defeat to Assyria. So actually, it's Assyria which is taking us further back. So if I go through the same thing here, we know when Parthians, Seleucids, Alexander the Great, the Persians, sack of Nineveh. That's when the great Assyrian Empire, as was, came to an end. A consortium of different nations came and eventually squeezed the life out of Assyria. I don't mean that everybody died, I mean that the empire was gone. But before that time, from, 612, I think, BC, before that time, the Assyrians documented things very well, and archaeologists have found libraries of information. So there's been a lot to go on. So if we're pretty sure about 612 BC, which we are from other sources, then we can go back. There we are. Then we can go back that way. We know when the Assyrians sacked Thebes in Egypt. We know when they conquered Israel. We know about sack of Babylon, 810 BC. There's another great conquering king of Assyria, Shalmaneser, very well known, had very good records. So every year we can read, Shalmaneser went here, conquered this, conquered that. Shalmaneser went there, conquered this, conquered that. Of course, we have to trust it, but at least we got the records, which look like they're approximately trustworthy. And why they're a bit trustworthy? Because Limu list. The Limus were, what were they? I don't know. They're a class of officials in Assyria. And there's a list, one after the other, and it is very well dated. It must have astronomical information on it, mustn't it? Sorry, I've never actually looked and read the Elimo list myself, have I? So, I mean, I should say that. I'm not a historian. I rely very much on what I read, and I have to, of course, make decisions in my mind as to what I can trust, but if I'm looking at facts that people are reporting, I'm usually trusting of those facts. And I'm looking at opinion, then I'm not so trusting. My job, I suppose, that I gave myself, was to bring a bit of logic and to try and put it all together. So I'm perfectly content that historians know what they're talking about, and that from 911 or 912 BC, the start of the limo list, we've got a year or so of uncertainty. Everything is very well dated with reference to Assyria, and then after that we've got the Greek records and all the rest of it that takes us through to modern times. I've also stuck Hattie up there, which is much less well dated, to be honest, but I just wanted to include it on my scheme of things. So yes, there was a kingdom of Cappadocia. We know when Alexander the Great came through, the Persians came through. What we don't know a lot about is these Neo-Hittite kingdoms. Hittites, but not one Hittite empire, broken into lots of small kingdoms. So, these are things that we know, and I think I'm going to risk, possibly with the help of an expert. So going back through, you can see the dates on the left there, going back through these dates. You can see the 5 lands that I've been talking about, with the exception of Israel so far. And doesn't look quite the same here, but never mind. You can see that it all goes dark at a certain point. The one that goes furthest is Assyria, the start of the limo list. 911, 912 BC is what that should correspond to. I know it doesn't quite look right, but that's what it's supposed to be. And after that, we know nothing, except that's not true. We do know something. We know lots. You surely know there's large amounts of records of endless pharaohs of Egypt. We're on Egypt at the moment. Pharaohs, not just pharaohs, other records to do with other things that were going on in Egypt. And it's not only Egypt. What we're struggling with now is anchoring it to the dates that we know more recently. So, for example, says he, not just for example, but let's start there. Ramesses III, a time of turmoil outside Egypt's borders. I've put him as year 0, simply because I don't know when these things should be, but I'm going to say, let's call that year 0 for Ramesses III, and we'll work back in time, because we can. From Ramesses III backwards, we can pretty much link all the pharaohs and events together almost definitely. I mean, as an aside, I'll just click the next one, Ramesses II there. The gap between Ramesses II and Ramesses III has actually been the subject of a lot of debate. And you know about Mr. Velikovsky from a long time ago, who I really enjoyed reading Velikovsky. This is one of the things that really got me started on this sort of road. I enjoyed reading David Rohl as well, and others. And Immanuel Velikovsky, am I remembering right? I'm pretty sure I'm remembering right. Came up with a very different gap between those two. And in a sense, it was a long time ago that he came out with that. There has been a lot of things discovered, translated, and all the rest of it since then. And my impression, what I read from historians, is that we can really be very certain now, with the documents that we've found, that link, there's about 10 years, that link one known bit with another known bit. So that 10-year gap, we're relying on documents from, a lot of it from the town of the tomb builders, you know, the ones that were building the tombs for the pharaohs. There's a lot of stuff there, which, anyway, as I say, I have to trust what I think I should trust, and that's what I think I should trust. If I'm right, then we can work back, and Tutankhamun, of course, you know. I'm just listing one or two key people. Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh, the one who kind of tried to change the religion of Egypt and basically led to a bit of a collapse of the country. Tutmosis III, conquering pharaoh, conquered Palestine, Egypt, Palestine, what's next? Syria, that's right. Up into Syria. Not all of these places, but he conquered very widely. Hatshepsut, female pharaoh, one or two well-known bits of monumental architecture that's come from her time. And we know back to the time of Pharaoh Ahmose. And Pharaoh Ahmose was responsible for eventually driving the Hyksos. They were the people, Asiatic people, that dominated Egypt for quite a long time. That's how long that is outside of what I'm talking about now. But from that time, from the time the Hyksos were driven out until the time of Ramesses III, we can be pretty sure. And I've put Ramesses III, a time of turmoil outside Egypt's borders, because I'm going to try to synchronize things a bit here. Actually, it was quite easy to go from one to the other, so perhaps I will risk it again. Control-Tab. So, I haven't put a year 0 now. I've put it in a certain place, and the place I've put it is actually where conventional history would put these things. Come back in a moment to how conventional history gets there, and then what I'm proposing as an alternative. But let's just go through the other places. Hatti next. Fall of Hattusash, or Hattusha. This, most people would say, ties in approximately to the time of Ramesses III. Well, maybe a bit before the time of Ramesses III, because inscriptions at the time of Ramesses III speak of disruption in Hatti, or defeat of Hatti. So a little bit before that time. But from that time backwards, we know a lot about the Hittite Empire. It's very well recorded. A lot of documents, stone tablets, were found at the Hittite capital of Hattusash, and we can work out when one of the great kings, Hattusili III, was ruling and fighting and what have you, Suppiluliuma, who carved out the really large Hittite Empire. Jumping back with a little bit less certainty now, one of the very early great pharaohs, we'll talk about in a moment, and another one, Hattusili I. Before that, we really don't know. It's much more vague and obscure. But approximately, we can put that lot on the other diagram. Let's try and do that. So there we are. It's supposed to link across reasonably. Assyria, we know again, murder of Tukulti-Ninurta. After that, we stopped knowing stuff. Before that, plenty of records. One of the great pharaohs, he's responsible for the sack of Babylon. Another Shalmaneser up there is another of the great conquering pharaohs. Did I say pharaoh? I meant king. Ashurbanipal, I put him there for a reason in a moment. And yes, sorry, we could have put some more beyond. The point is, we've got a king list. The king list is fairly nice and consistent from there to there, meaning we've got a lot of other information to check it against. And we go further back, we've got much less other information. So yes, there is a king list, but can we trust it? Can we not trust it is the question. Babylon, similarly, a little bit after year 0 here. Babylon was sacked by Elamites, sacked by Assyria. We've just seen that was Tukulti-Ninurta. Bunaburiash, well, we'll again put him on the main scale in a minute and then just say a word or two about that. Before that, there was a dynasty of kings called Kassite kings, and they took over not long after a Hittite conquest, which we will come to again shortly. So, and Amisaduga, why not? Some of you will know all about Amisaduga. We can go further back. There's if I'm confident back to there, which I'm not totally, then we can be pretty confident a fair bit before that, back to the time of Hammurabi as well. But we'll leave that and move on to Greece, where we know much less, to be truthful. Trojan War. Who believes that there was a Trojan War? Well, that's a fair number. I think most historians would think that there was something there. Of course, nobody, I'd say nobody, but it's very unusual to find somebody who actually believes that the gods came down and did what it says in Homer's Iliad. But the point of there being a Trojan War, Greece against Troy, yeah, that's much more widely believed. And if you read what it says on some of the monuments of Egypt, it seems to refer to a time, not just the collapse of Hatti, but also warfare in the Aegean, and it's kind of likely that that's when the Trojan War took place. Apart from anything else, it's probably what precipitated the collapse of Hatti anyway. So maybe it should be in a bracket, but I've put it there. Before that time, we know a certain amount about Mycenaean civilization, but we do not know internal dating from Greece. We just do not have the literature. We can't read it. They were writing, but we have so few records that there's nothing, probably virtually 0 records. We got various bits of writing, but not anything that will help us historically. I put eruption of Thera there. I'm sure that a lot of you know lots about that. We know that the eruption of Thera marked the change from Minoan civilization on Crete and surrounding islands to Mycenaean civilization when the Greeks conquered Crete. That much we know from archaeology. You can see the ash from the eruption and all the changes in pottery style and all that sort of thing. We may not know when it happened in absolute terms, but in relative terms, we know it was then. I simply wanted to say that we have a lot of cross-correlations here. I've referred to the fact that Egyptian inscriptions talk about trouble. At that time, we can deduce that the Trojan War probably took place. We've got cross-correlations. One of the best known, the Amarna letters. The Amarna letters dug up from Egypt at the time of Akhenaten. They represent the time of Akhenaten in Egypt. And we can look across. And there's letters to and from Burnaburiash in Babylon. There's letters from, at least, Ashurbanipal in Assyria. There's letters, or a letter from Suppiluliuma in Hatti. So we know, at that time, things match nicely. The peace treaty is supposed to be between Ramesses II and Hattusili III. We know about that. We know the Hittite conquest because a Babylonian document says the Hittites came and took Babylon, and a Hittite document says Mursili was conqueror of Babylon. So, putting two and two together, we know that those fit together nicely. Ooh, what else? Probably lots of other things that I can't remember unless I see my crib list. Tutankhamun, that's an interesting one. Tutankhamun died, was buried, lots of gold, we know about that. But apart from all the gold, when Tutankhamun died very young, that left a problem for Egypt. Who's going to be the next pharaoh? Well, the next pharaoh was somebody called A.Y. But a delegation arrived to Suppiluliuma, who was fighting in Syria at the time, and the delegation was to say, look, have we got one of your sons, please, to marry the widow of the king? Because we don't want, well, anyway, the queen didn't want want to have to marry somebody else, basically. It all went wrong. The son of Suppiluliuma got murdered on the way to Egypt. But the point is that we've got a cross-correlation there, which not everybody believes, but I think the evidence is good enough. The name that we're given is the first throne name, is that the right word? Yes, of Tutankhamun, and we certainly know that it was Suppiluliuma. So it all ties in, and there's other things. Oh, the eruption of Thera, I should say. I said that marked the change from Minoan to Mycenaean, but we can also, from the pottery type we got there, we can come across to Egypt, and we can say that pretty definitely that was, it's quite a good thing I've got a black line there, that's when it took place. That was sometime, actually probably just after the time of Thutmose III. So, apart from the fact my green one has got slightly too high for some reason, I don't know how that happened, things correlate reasonably well. But what about the absolute dates? Where do they all come from? Well, what excuse have today's historians got for assigning those dates? You can look it up on Wikipedia, those are the dates. You look it up on somewhere else, they're slightly different, but they're not that different. Today's historians have kind of consolidated around a set of dates. It changes every 10 years or so. It seems to come down a little bit every 10 years or so, because they're a little bit embarrassed by some of the bits of history that are missing. But there is justification. They're not stupid, today's historians. They are working with some evidence. And the Assyrian king list is one piece of evidence. Now, we can trust Assyrian rulers back to Adad-nirari II, 911, actually nowadays you'll read 912 more usually, but approximately then. Does that work? Oh, it does work. Good. So the king list goes back in time, and Tukulti-Ninurta I, if you remember, one of the things that I had on that page just now was the murder of Tukulti-Ninurta I. And I said after that, things are not really known. But before it, yes, we do know. So all we've got to do is add them up. And we can do that. We lose a few years because, when it says 18 years, it doesn't necessarily mean exactly 18. It means more than 17. You're into the 18th year is what it normally means. So approximately, murdered in 1197 BC. I'm not going to go back to the spreadsheet, but that hopefully will be approximately what it shows on that spreadsheet. So there is justification for the traditional Egyptian history. Now, I said we don't really know much after the time that the Assyrians sacked Thebes, and that was in 664 BC. But we can sort of get it about right, and we glance across at the Bible. We notice that Pharaoh Shishak came and invaded and conquered Judea in, sometime after King Solomon died, which we work out is about 925 BC based on the Bible. We also know that this guy had a campaign in Palestine in his 20th year, 925 BC. Well, that's why we put the dates there, to make it match 925 BC. It's wrong, by the way, but that's what people are basing Egyptian history on. Well, I say it's wrong, put it that way. We can work back. First thing we can do, I mentioned Manetho before, compiler of a king list, and some bits of Manetho we've got, some other bits we don't have. We do have these rulers there, with their number of years that they ruled. Before that, Manetho's fairly hopeless for all these Rameseses. Altogether, Ramesses III to Ramesses XI, one after the other. Manetho just says, I don't know, a lot of pharaohs for quite a lot of time, and it depends which version of Manetho you believe, because it's just recorded, transcribed or borrowed bits of information from Manetho that we have. But internal documentation takes us confidently from Ramesses III through getting less confident, about Ramesses IX, now getting much less confident, but never mind the level of confidence. This is the justification which modern historians, if you like, have got for suggesting Ramesses III about 1180 to 1148 BC. And it ties in with what we've just said about the death of Tukulti-Ninurta. So they're really not stupid. They do have a couple of quite strong bits of evidence. Sometimes you can look at the Babylonian king list and try and convince yourself that that also works, but it honestly doesn't. We don't know much about Babylon prior to the time that they started recording all the astronomical observations, but we know that this king, Shamash-Mudammiq, was a contemporary of Adad-Nirari. If you remember, that was the last Assyrian, the earliest Assyrian king that we've got confidence for. And so working back in the Babylonian king list, we can go back like this, and you see there's a lot of dynasties: Second Isin dynasty, Second Sealand dynasty, Bazi, Elamite dynasty E. There's a question mark there somewhere. Shamash-Mudammiq's got a question mark, to be honest, as to what length his reign would be. In fact, so we go beyond further later, there's a lot of uncertainty about reign lengths. But you can add all that lot up, and it still gives the wrong answer. It gets about this, but to be truthful, you've kind of got to add a bit more to get it to tie in with Egypt and Assyria. And the question mark comes in handy there, plus Shamash himself can be assigned a nice long reign as well. And so you can convince yourself, if you're a historian, that it ties in. And that's what they do. So 3 king lists, or 3 lands where we're looking at the rulers, and they more or less tie in. But there are problems. Here's a problem. Greek pottery. Mycenaean 3C, that's from around the time of the Trojan War. Geometric, see, 9th century BC. Proto-geometric, definite descendant of that, definite progenitor of that. Now, I'm not a pottery expert, of course, but this is what you read. And I can see there's some links. And people are not looking at just 3 pots, obviously. They're looking at a huge range of pots when they're working these things out. But it's a big gap for proto-geometric. Not just no archaeology, but things to be so unchanging for so long just doesn't quite tie in with what happens normally. Babylonian records. There's the kings we had just now on the Babylonian king list from, it's only a section of them that I've put in there. But looking at those, we've got, these are, when I say records, I mean this sort of a thing, dug up, sometimes just a brick with an inscription on it, dug up from the ground somewhere in Babylonia. And for these kings, looking at how long they reigned, it averages 0.4, 0.6, 0.5, 0.5, meaning about 1 record every 2 years has been found sitting in the ground there. 1 record every 20 years there. It's a warning flag, isn't it, that something's not right. At least, I think, to any logical person, it's a warning that something is not right. Now, I'm a bit out of date, I must admit. I've based this on a compilation of records, which there probably is an accessible, more modern version, but I couldn't find one at the time. So that was in Babylon. Then in Egypt, this David Rohl drew attention to these, the genealogies of Egypt. Here's one of them. Nespaherenhat, contemporary of Asorkon I. We know the dates for Asorkon I. Well, we don't, but I'm just giving you the traditional dates for Asorkon I. And back to somebody who's almost certainly, judging by other words there, a contemporary of Meneptah. And it works out 8 generations, 37 years per generation. Not impossible, but a bit large, a bit unlikely to average out over 8 generations. And here's one directly from Asorkon I, back through various kings and through to an ancestor, chief of the Meshwesh, probably contemporary of Ramesses III, approximately. Now, it is only approximate, I must admit, this one, and only probable. But it gives the same, it's pure coincidence, but it gives the same 37-year generation. Now, of course you can have children after being aged 37, but these are mostly firstborn generation. It's just a little bit unlikely, firstborn children. Again highlighted by David Rohl, the Serapeum, where they buried bulls, real bulls. They buried bulls that were kept as the living incarnation of the god, that's supposed to be the god Apis there. And at the Serapeum, we've got a few bulls. A lot of them we've got inscriptions for, so we know what Pharaoh and year of Pharaoh and all that sort of thing, that burial took place. So we got one that we know there, time of Asorkon II, traditional dates, not necessarily correct, and Ramesses IX. About the last Ramesses we got real confidence in the relative dating of, looking further back, I mean. But that works out at 34 years for a bull lifetime, and that is too much. Normal means later on, after this time where we've got everything very well dated, 18 years is the normal length of time, because the bulls were taken as a small calf and they were tended, eventually they died and got buried. So something's wrong, this won't be news to most of you, so let's just move on to this. This is just my views about various absolute dating techniques that we might refer to. Carbon dating, I trust carbon dating. It's a very good scientific thing. It's been well calibrated, but it's got problems. It's got problems near the Mediterranean, which I shall flag up shortly. Tree rings. I trust tree rings, but only if I've got a tree ring sequence which I can relate it to. When I say I mean the tree ring expert can relate it to say what year some bit of wood relates to. And there isn't a trustworthy Middle Eastern sequence. Not really. There's one in Turkey, but it's too far away for pretty much all that we're interested in here. The eruption of Thera, we know when it took place, as I indicated earlier, but what was the date? We can look for evidence. We can look at in the Greenland ice cores, and we can look at a layer of acidic ice and say, oh, that relates to something or other. Maybe that was Thera. We can look in the tree ring data and we can say, here's narrow tree ring bands, low growth. Maybe that was Thera. But we're not. And those two represent narrow tree ring dates that a lot of people have referred to. But if I was to go back to the spreadsheet, you'd notice the eruption of Thera conventionally is put about 1450, so it doesn't tie in with any of that lot. The Venus tablets of Amisaduga. Well, these are recordings on tablets of the movements of Venus as it sort of comes and goes, morning star, evening star, and you can approximately back calculate when we must be talking about, but only approximately, because there's a cycle. It comes and it goes, and it comes and it goes, relative to what? It's relative to moon. Yes, of course, relative to observations of the moon. That's what related to as well. And it works out there are certain dates which could correlate to the coronation of this king of Babylon, Amisaduga. And most historians will look at 1582 and say, oh yeah, that fits in more or less, works for me. Some of the Babylonians will say, no, sorry, we want a few more years, so they go a bit older. But it's another way that people have got of absolute dates. But we could go earlier and we could find some more solutions that match. We could do later and we can find some more solutions that match. And when it comes to Thera, we can find lesser acidity peaks in an ice core, and perhaps that might be Thera. So there's always more than two options. The Abus Papyrus, very well known from Egypt, talking about the star Sirius rising just before dawn, or does it? Because it doesn't say that. It says the going forth of Sirius, and people assume. And its traditional interpretation has been fairly discredited just based on the tablet, and David Rohl said a lot about that. This is what I would suggest is a sensible solution, and then we'll have a look at how that works in the Dark Ages. Carbon dating. The carbon in the atmosphere comes from various sources, and some of it comes from the oceans. And because the Mediterranean was stagnant, it was feeding, if you like, old carbon into the atmosphere, with a lot of C12 and less C14, which means that from lands around the Mediterranean, we cannot be certain about carbon dating over quite a long period. And the error, well, this is just what I would suggest, I would suggest up to about 300 years. But a lot of historians find themselves utterly unable to trust carbon dating because it simply doesn't match what they've worked out, and that's without any shifting of history. So I think there's enough evidence, I'm sure some of you are well aware of this evidence, to say that that is reasonable. I've said there's no applicable data. There is I said you could choose other ice acidity peaks from the ice core records of Greenland. Here's one, 1284 BC. It's not the biggest, but why should the eruption of Thera have caused a very large acidity of the ice? Pretty sure that Krakatoa didn't, and Krakatoa was pretty violent. So, experts, you can't trust experts. Sometimes I'm called an expert on things to do with engineering, and don't trust me on that. Ammisaduga of Babylon, I would go with a later solution, again, well publicized, 1419 BC. Abus Papyrus, now this is something a little bit different. The Abus Papyrus, it's the meaning of the tablet which is the problem. It doesn't really say this is when the star Sirius rose just before dawn on this day. What it says is it's a religious thing that took place celebrating the goddess, Sopdet, the Egyptian goddess that represents Sirius. I am suggesting that it was 1379 BC, and that was the end of what you call a great year. And I don't think I'm going to go into a great year because I think a lot of you are very familiar already, and if you're not, there just isn't time to go into it. Here's an eclipse tablet. I'm suggesting there are various dates for this eclipse tablet from Ugarit on the Syrian coast. Several solutions. It's not my solution. A lot of people have suggested it, and I'm suggesting too that that's a sensible solution. There's, when I say a lot, there's only about two, I would say, that match the tablet reasonably well. The other one's down in 10 something or other BC. So, I'm proposing a solution which is not so dissimilar from some others. It's got certain details, quite significant details, which are dissimilar. So David Rohl came up with a solution which is fairly similar to mine for a while, and then he deviates by about another couple of 100 years as he puts a lot more years in various places. Velikovsky is rather different. But there have been others that some of you are well aware of that are not too different from what I'm suggesting, which is that we lop about 150 years off conventional history. That's what it boils down to. The problem is, and now I'm coming to after going all that way around, this is what I really want to put in front of you. What is the solution to the Dark Ages? Because I've said, historians are not stupid. They've taken these king lists, and at least Egypt and Assyria, they match. They may have problems with some absolute dates, but who doesn't have problems with absolute dates? You can believe what you want sometimes with absolute dates. And with Babylon, they've kind of convinced themselves that the king list has got just about enough space, leeway in there, to make their solution work. So how on earth can we get around that? Well, that's what these last three slides are supposed to do. Here's the Assyrian king list, and this is what I'm proposing to do with it. How can I do that? I've cut it, basically, and overlapped it. Not the only person who's proposed doing something similar to this. What is my justification? Well, a broad justification is that certainly we know that at some stages, well, perhaps we really only know one stage, the Assyrians had a dual kingship system. But I think, well, I'm fairly sure, at least some of the work that's been done over the last 10 or 20 years has shown that it's not just at some stage. There was a ruler that was ruling in Ashur, the traditional capital, and there was like a second ruler that was mostly based over in the southwest of the country. Sorry, that way around. Southwest of the country. However, more specifically, why have I overlapped it like that? Because we've got a couple of Ashur-Eshurishis, we've got a couple of Tiglath-Pilesers, and we've got a couple of Ashurnasipols that sort of match each other. Ashur-Eshurishi doesn't match that well, the years are completely different. But Tiglath-Pileser is the big one, really. Tiglath-Pileser is well known in the sense that his activities are very well recorded. His dates, no, obviously not so well known. He did a lot of conquering, left us records of that, and subsequent literature referred back to Tiglath-Pileser as a great pharaoh. And then people think about Tiglath-Pileser II. Well, when he was down there was no suggestion he was a great pharaoh. Tiglath-Pileser I, on the other hand, yes, people kind of accept he was a great pharaoh. I'm suggesting they're the same person. There was a dual kingship system, which was then brought to an end, and then was reinstigated, probably in response to problems that Assyria was having. And so Tiglath-Pileser's sons, Ashur-Dapla-Echor is one of them, Ashur-Dan, there we are, is another one, and Ashur-Bel-Kala is another one, ruled in parallel with each other until, here we are, Adad-Nirari II, the one we know, and the parallel ruling was continuing until the death of Tukulti-Ninurta II, when this Ashurnasirpal simply became the sole ruler of Assyria again. I could be wrong, of course, but I'm 100% convinced that we need to find this 150 years, and I'm pretty sure this is a logical solution for it. And it means that all the way through, we've got one pharaoh, that's this lot down here, that are, I won't say well recorded, but relatively better recorded. And then from Ashur-Dan, it's that lot that's better recorded. And virtually nothing. Virtually nothing is suspicious, you know. To rule a whole land like Assyria and have virtually nothing that refers to you is nuts. I mean, it's beyond coincidence, if you see what I mean. So that's Assyria. So if you work all that lot out, Tukulti-Ninurta now is murdered in 1056, about 150 years later than normally thought. Here's the other really, if you like, the plank of conventional history, Egypt. This is the one we got confidence in. Here are some strange names that we've got virtually no records, except Persenis I, plenty of records, know all about him. Nothing, very little, and now we're getting a bit more confident back here. So I'm going to be cutting it here under Ramesses XI, because we really don't know how things went after that, and I think there's very good reason for thinking that they didn't go according to what people are suggesting. So we'll do that again. They all moved over there. We've got another character appearing, Siamun there, and then eventually the headings will come down. So I'm happy with the 20th dynasty, except that during the time of Ramesses IX, this gentleman, Herihor, in my opinion, in the opinion of others, it was during the time of Ramesses XI, but I don't think that holds water. This gentleman, Herihor, was priest in Thebes, virtually set up a separate administration. Priest was not just, like a priest today. Priest was ruler, had real authority. That was in the north of the country, Thebes, south of the country, Thebes. In the north of the country, in Tanis, we had other things taking place. Specifically, Smendes, we know, was a ruler in Tanis. But my suggestion is, he wasn't, although he's given a dynasty name by Manetho, who compiled these histories, he's not really a ruler. He's a vizier. He's an administrative person charged with looking after northern Egypt. But almost a pharaoh, just like the priests were almost pharaohs. So who knows who's a pharaoh and who isn't a pharaoh? It's a kind of anybody's guess, and so it's a bit, what do we got? Oh, I know, it's like in Venezuela. Who knows who's the prime minister and who isn't the prime minister or president? You just declare yourself president and there you are. So if I'm right, This is a line of priests that were in Thebes, and Ramesses Ramesses X and XI, basically they disappeared from history. We've got very few records, so they know they were there. We've got a document or two that refers to them. It's kind of in the background that, you know, they were there, but they're not like they were doing very much. In the north, Pusenis I, we know a lot about, we think, and not just me, think was a son of Pinugem I, took over as priest, which basically means senior ruler in the north of the country, and then was followed by Siamun, that's my suggestion, down there, where 21st dynasty are relegated, apart from Pusenis I, are relegated to viziers, administrative persons, taking us through until we come to Shoshenq I, and then things started to change again. You know, at the time of Shoshenq I, we've still got Siamun as a high priest in Tanis, who's really the senior person. But Shoshenq I, apparently, you know, he played his cards right and became the senior ruler, and somebody died in the north, Pinugem II, and Eaput is a son of Shoshenq I, so he made a power grab, installed his son as priest, and eventually he became, he instigated the 22nd dynasty. So it's a solution which I think makes sense. There's evidence for this guy, Amenemophthes, and this guy, Amenemnisu, being contemporaries of Pusenis I. I would suggest the order's a bit wrong here, but let's not worry about messing around with details like that. If this is correct, then we can say Ramesses III now has dates which are about 150 years more recent. So what about the Babylonian king list? Not so much difficulty here because it doesn't work anyway. It simply doesn't have enough years in there to really fill what was going on. But still difficult because we have to work out what was going on, why, and all that sort of thing. So keep your eyes on some of these things. But okay, so let's go with this one. Sorry, I forgot. There's a document, the Eclectic Chronicle. Why is it called the Eclectic Chronicle? I suppose because it's a bit of a hodgepodge. Nobody totally understands what it's about. There is a line in the Eclectic Chronicle that says, Adad Apla Edina took over at Babylon. Where had he gone? Adad Apla Edina. There we are, 23 years. Lovely. Took on. And then nobody quite knows what it means, but to me it looks like it means in year 1 of Simbar Shippak, which was also year 5 of Elmas Shakin Shumi. There we are, Elmas Shakin Shumi. Year 14 of, sorry, that's the trouble with texts, where you dig them up after thousands of years, you get bits missing. So we don't know. But I have a theory about that one, which I'll click in a minute. Marbiti Apla Usur, year 4 of him, and year 1 of Nabu Mukin Apli, down there. So, to me, it seems perfectly logical interpretation that this chronicle is saying that this is all the same year. In the year that Adad Apla Edina took Babylon, these other people were ruling, but they weren't ruling at Babylon. Simbar Shippak was ruling somewhere towards the east. Who's the other one? Oh, Ilma Shakin Shumi, maybe he was somewhere around Babylon, because this one probably wasn't actually a king, more like a vizier, like we just said about Egypt. This is the previous king, Marduk Shapik Zeri. It says year 14, awarded 13, because in his 14th year, when he went and visited another city outside of Babylon, this guy took over. So I'll just click that, and there we go, Marduk Shapik Zeri. Well, anyway, this one was ruling somewhere else, and this one was ruling just a bit outside Babylon somewhere. I'm not going to really suggest exactly where these centres of power were. I could suggest one or two of them, but not all of them. But to me, that's the meaning of the chronicle. If we put that into action, then those lot... Oh, this is taking its time, but hopefully it'll get there in the end. This really is taking its time. Let's give it a bit of a... It just needs a bit of encouragement, that's all. Another one going up there somewhere. Lovely. And that one's going up there somewhere. And that one's just going to move up. Boop. Boing. That took a while yesterday to try and get this to work properly. Or the day before. So what I'm suggesting is that when this guy, he went to meet the Assyrian ruler in another city, Sippar, north of Babylon, this guy, who was an Aramean, not really Babylonian, took over. And at the same time, basically, the society collapsed and different cities went their own way and set up their own rulers. And there were parallel rules. So the Arameans didn't survive in Babylon for long, but they ruled a fair chunk of southern Babylonia through these next few rulers. These were in the east towards Elam. Oh, there's an Elamite dynasty, so that's probably towards Elam as well. And dynasty of Bazi, I think, are just viziers working under the authority of the main kings there. So if I'm right in suggesting that, then the Elamite conquest, which was the last event that was properly tied to preceding history, the Elamite conquest comes in at 1012 BC, which, if we went back to the spreadsheet, I'll drag it all down, and it would all kind of make sense with about a 150-year reduction in history. So that's it, really. I know it's been a lot of gumph, and if you want the full works, then I suggest you borrow the book from whoever it is who's bought it already. But you can buy one if you want. Conclusion, difficult road, pretty sure I'm there or thereabouts. Well, most people would say that when they come up with some sort of revision of history. But yeah, I am pretty sure. I did this a few years back. I haven't seen any reason to change my mind significantly. I'm not pretending it's certain to the absolute year, but I'm very content. I'm very content with something. I think I won't go back to the spreadsheet. I said I was going to mention Israel at the end, so I'll just conclude with that and say that now, if you reconstruct the history of Israel, to me, things make much more sense. Moses leaves Egypt right at the end of the Hyksos period, just before the very well-known bit that we were talking about. And the Hyksos were very famous for being cruel to everybody in Egypt, and doubtless the Israelites would have had as much or more cruelty to them, well, more actually, than the Egyptian population at large. The geography is right. It's the right part of Egypt that was there, that the Hyksos were ruling from. And yeah, so that makes good sense to me. Joshua is now conquering Israel at a time at the end of the Middle Bronze Age, where archaeology tells us that pretty much all the cities that Joshua is supposed to have conquered were actually either destroyed or substantially damaged. They recovered most of them. They recovered their Canaanite culture, most of them. But that's what it says in the Bible. They were conquered, but they were not held onto. Coming down, who should we come to next? Well, we come right down to the time of David and Solomon. David is now becoming powerful right at the time, didn't really spell it out here, that Egyptian power is crumbling completely. Well, the time when all of these parallel rulers were developing, viziers and what have you here and there, priests ruling here and there. And with Solomon following, and then Solomon's reign comes, and after the time of Solomon, then the conquest of Jerusalem. Yes, the conquest of Jerusalem by Pharaoh Shishak is not the Shishak that they would normally, historians would normally assign it to. It's a different Shishak, but anyway, who's there in the history. And so on. You know, I think the time of Deborah, who was, they were fighting Hatzor as the biggest, as the most powerful city in Palestine, is a time when we have letters that refer to the king of Hatzor as king. Everybody else is not king. They're just governors and lesser people. So that makes sense. The time of Gideon makes sense. I can't think of who else we got. Of course, we got Saul and Samuel and Samson. To my mind, it all makes much better sense. And we can go back to the time of Joseph and find now a very plausible time, Pharaoh and what have you, where Joseph would fit in. Abraham, to me, the events of Abraham's life, the battle he fought against the invading kings. You remember the battle of 5 kings against 4 kings? That all ties in nicely. So I'm not, I will not say it is right, absolutely right. But I didn't set out to change the world. I set out to understand, firstly for my own purpose, so that I can appreciate what the Bible says a bit more. And I think I've got there. So that's what I mean by I'm there or thereabouts. Okay, that's it. I'm done. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much. That was really, really interesting.
You're welcome.